9 experienced hikers set out into the Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia in early February 1959. They were young, skilled, and determined to conquer one of the most challenging winter treks in the region. None of them would return alive. What happened during that expedition remains one of the most chilling and unexplained mysteries in modern history. The leader of the group was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. His team included 8 others: Zinaida Kolmogorova, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Krivonischenko, and Semyon Zolotaryov. Each of them was physically fit and well-versed in survival skills. Their plan was to reach Otorten Mountain, deep in the northern Urals, a route graded as Category 3, the most difficult level of difficulty at the time. They began their journey on January 25, 1959, traveling by train from Sverdlovsk to Ivdel, then by truck to a remote village called Vizai, the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness. Spirits were high. The group took photographs, laughed, and kept a diary along the way. Their notes showed nothing out of the ordinary. On January 31st, they reached the edge of the highlands. The next day, February 1st, they began their ascent toward Kholat Syakhl, which translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. That name would later become hauntingly appropriate. That evening, they set up camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The weather had turned harsh, strong winds, heavy snow, and freezing temperatures. They pitched their tent on an open slope, rather than descending into the forested area below, likely to save time or because they lost their way due to poor visibility. It was their final night. When Dyatlov's group failed to send a telegram confirming their return by February 12th, no one panicked initially. Delays were common in such expeditions. But as days passed with no word, family members and fellow students grew worried. By February 20th, a search party was organized. Students, volunteers, and eventually the Soviet military joined in. Helicopters and planes scoured the frozen terrain. On February 26th, searchers made a grim discovery. On the slope of Kholat Syakhl, they found the hiker's tent. It was partially collapsed and covered in snow. The sight inside was strange. The tent had been cut open from the inside. All their belongings were there: boots, coats, food, even money and cameras, but no people. Footprints led away from the tent, about 9 sets, all made by people either barefoot or wearing only socks. The tracks led downhill toward a forest about 1.5 kilometers away. Then they vanished under fresh snow. At the edge of the forest, searchers found the remains of a small fire and the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. They were lying side by side, barefoot, dressed only in underwear. The branches of a nearby cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed it. Between the forest and the tent, 3 more bodies were found: Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. Their positions suggested they were trying to crawl back toward the tent. Dyatlov's fists were clenched, his face turned toward camp. Kolmogorova had multiple bruises. Slobodin had a fractured skull. None of them wore shoes or proper clothing for the sub-zero weather. The remaining 4 hikers were missing. Took 2 more months until May for searchers to find them. They were buried under several meters of snow in a ravine further into the forest. The condition of these last 4 bodies shocked investigators. Ludmila Dubinina had her ribs broken and her tongue missing. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles had a crushed skull. Zolotaryov and Kolevatov also had multiple fractures. The injuries were severe, yet there were no external wounds on the skin. It looked as if they'd been struck by a massive force, something powerful enough to break bones without leaving bruises. Even more confusing was how some of them were dressed in pieces of clothing from the others, signs they had removed clothes from their dead companions to survive longer. But that didn't explain why they had left the tent half-naked in the first place. The autopsies revealed no signs of struggle or external attack. Toxicology tests were negative. The official conclusion at the time was vague. The hikers died due to a compelling natural force. But no one could agree on what that force was. Theories began to swirl. Some said it was an avalanche, forcing them to cut open the tent and flee. But there was little evidence of an avalanche. The tent was still partly standing, the slope wasn't steep enough, and the snow didn't match avalanche patterns. Others suggested a katabatic wind, a sudden violent gust that could terrify even experienced climbers. Yet even that didn't explain the internal injuries or missing tongue. Some investigators quietly suspected a military test. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Army was known to conduct secret experiments in remote regions, parachute mines, radiation tests, or new weapons. Interestingly, traces of radioactive material were found on some of the hikers' clothing. This raised suspicions that they had accidentally entered a restricted area or witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Locals from the Mansi tribe who lived nearby were also questioned. Some outsiders speculated that the hikers might have been attacked. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints other than the hikers' own. The Mansi were known to be peaceful, and they cooperated fully with the search efforts. In the following months, the Soviet authorities closed the case abruptly. Files were archived, and access was restricted. For decades, details of the Dyatlov Pass incident were hidden behind layers of secrecy. Years later, when the case files were declassified, the mystery deepened. The photos and diaries recovered from the hikers' cameras showed them laughing, posing, and setting up camp. Everything looked normal until the last entries, then silence. The final image on one of the cameras was a blurry frame taken at night, possibly showing bright orbs in the sky. No one could determine what happened between that night and their deaths. 9 skilled hikers, terrified enough to slice open their own tent, fled barefoot into the deadly cold, and died scattered across the snow, some with crushed ribs, some with missing eyes or tongue, all with secrets they took to the grave. Whatever happened on that mountain wasn't ordinary. And this was only the beginning. The discovery of the Dyatlov group's bodies left Soviet investigators facing one of the strangest cases they'd ever encountered. Nothing matched normal logic. The hikers' injuries were inconsistent. The evidence was contradictory. The official reports were vague, and many witnesses were silenced. But one thing was clear. Something forced 9 skilled mountaineers to abandon their tent in sub-zero temperatures, without shoes or coats, and run into the dark. The first thing investigators examined was the tent itself. It was found partially collapsed, covered with a thin layer of snow. Inside were all the essentials: their diaries, food, stoves, warm clothing, and boots. Nothing was missing. There were knife cuts made from inside, suggesting they cut their way out in a hurry. If they had time to use the door flap, they would have. This indicated panic. Something terrified them enough to escape instantly. Next came the footprints. They were clearly visible for over 500 meters before being buried by snow. The prints showed no signs of running or staggering, meaning they weren't fleeing chaotically. Yet they were barefoot or wearing only socks. That didn't match any rational decision. Even if something had scared them, they would have grabbed clothing first. Unless their fear was immediate, something they couldn't pause to question. Then came the first 2 bodies near the cedar tree, Krivonischenko and Doroshenko. Both were found in underwear, lying next to remains of a fire. Their bodies were burned, likely from being too close to the flames. Their hands had torn flesh. They'd ripped bark off the tree, possibly while climbing it. Branches broken up to 5 meters high suggested one of them tried to look back toward the tent, maybe to see what was happening. Their cause of death: hypothermia. The 3 hikers between the tree and the tent, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, appeared to have died trying to return. Dyatlov's body faced the direction of camp, fists clenched, showing determination or struggle. Kolmogorova had a broken nose and multiple bruises. Slobodin had a linear skull fracture, not fatal by itself, but it might have caused disorientation. All 3 died of hypothermia. The final 4, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault-Brignoles, were discovered weeks later under several meters of snow. Their conditions were far more severe. Dubinina had broken ribs and was missing her tongue and eyes. Zolotaryov also had broken ribs. Thibault-Brignoles' skull was crushed. The injuries were compared to a car crash, immense internal trauma without surface wounds. This detail was crucial. Such damage couldn't be caused by a fall from standing height or by blunt objects. It suggested exposure to a massive pressure force, something sudden and powerful, not hand-to-hand combat. Investigators ruled out animal attacks, as there were no bite marks. They also ruled out locals. There were no extra footprints or signs of struggle. Adding to the confusion, some of the hikers' clothes tested positive for radiation. Not enough to kill them, but enough to raise suspicion. At the time, the Soviet Union was conducting military tests, including parachute mines and missile experiments in remote areas. Some theorists believe the group accidentally entered a restricted test zone, witnessed something classified, and were silenced or affected by shock waves. Others pointed to bright orange spheres seen in the sky during that period. Multiple witnesses from nearby villages, including the search teams, reported strange glowing orbs hovering or moving across the horizon. The last photo on one of the cameras, a blurry image showing bright spots against darkness, added to the mystery. Could it have been a parachute flare, a missile, or something unexplained? However, the official investigation avoided direct military references. The final report, released in May 1959, simply stated, "The cause of death was an unknown compelling force which the hikers were unable to overcome. That was it. Case closed. Files sealed." But questions didn't stop. Locals from the nearby Mansi tribe had long believed the area was cursed. They called the mountain Kholat Syakhl, meaning mountain of the dead. According to legend, 9 Mansi hunters once died there long ago, the same number as the Dyatlov group. Though investigators dismissed this as superstition, the coincidence unsettled many. One possible explanation was avalanche. If snow started to slide toward their tent, they might have panicked, cut it open, and escaped. But experts reviewing terrain data later found the slope too shallow, the tent intact, and the area lacking avalanche debris. An avalanche strong enough to break bones would have buried the tent. But it wasn't. Another theory was katabatic winds, sudden, violent gusts that can disorient even skilled mountaineers. These winds could have caused snow slabs to shift, giving the illusion of an avalanche. Fear and low visibility might have led them to flee downhill. But this still doesn't explain internal trauma or missing organs. There's also the infrasound theory. Some researchers proposed that strong winds passing over the mountain created a low-frequency sound known as Kármán vortex street, which can trigger panic, nausea, and fear in humans. The hikers, overwhelmed by this psychological distress, might have fled the tent irrationally. But again, that wouldn't break bones or crush skulls. A darker theory points toward Soviet military experiments. Some believe parachute mines detonated above the area, producing shock waves strong enough to cause internal injuries, but leaving minimal external marks. These explosions could explain the glowing orbs in the sky, the burned tree, and the scattered group. Panic from nearby detonations might have caused them to flee. Radiation traces could also come from exposure to experimental weapon residue. But there's one more theory: human confrontation. Some suggest the group encountered another party, possibly soldiers or secret agents, and a struggle ensued. However, the lack of other footprints weakens this claim. Unless those responsible retrieved their own after the snowstorm or the fight happened elsewhere before they returned to camp. Another angle: paradoxical undressing. A well-documented phenomenon in hypothermia where victims remove clothes as their bodies overheat during the final stages. This might explain why some were half-naked, but not why they cut open their tent or had fractures like car crash victims. When the case was re-examined in 2019, Russian prosecutors reaffirmed the avalanche theory, despite expert disagreement. In 2020, the official report claimed the hikers died from hypothermia triggered by an avalanche and poor visibility. But avalanche experts challenged this, citing terrain evidence and tent position. Even decades later, no theory explains all the evidence. Why cut the tent from inside? Why flee barefoot into -30 degrees Celsius weather? Why massive internal injuries with no external trauma? Why missing tongue and eyes? Why radiation? Why glowing orbs in the sky? The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains a puzzle of contradictions. Photographs recovered from the hikers' cameras show smiles, laughter, and a calm journey up to the last day. Then silence. Their final diary entry was dated February 1st, mentioning worsening weather but no fear or conflict. After that, nothing. 9 young lives vanished into a storm, leaving behind more questions than answers. But there's one more layer to this mystery. Secret files, witness testimonies buried in archives, and clues unearthed years later. Some claim to know what really happened but were silenced or ignored. By the time the official investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident ended in May 1959, no one was satisfied. Not the families, not the searchers, not even some of the investigators themselves. The phrase "unknown compelling force" became a blanket statement for unanswered questions, and the Soviet government quickly sealed the files. What was supposed to be a routine mountain tragedy turned into one of the most perplexing and secretive cases in Russian history. When the files were declassified decades later, journalists and researchers began combing through them. What they found raised even more questions. Some pages were missing. Some witness statements were incomplete or redacted. And key pieces of evidence, including the hikers' clothing, tent fragments, and radiation reports, had either vanished or were poorly documented. One of the strangest revelations came from Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator on the case. In a 1990 interview, Ivanov admitted that during the search, he was pressured by superiors to ignore certain findings. He later claimed that searchers and officials had reported strange orange lights moving in the sky during the nights around February 1st and 2nd, 1959. Ivanov suggested the hikers may have witnessed the same phenomenon, possibly linked to secret missile tests, and that their deaths were connected to a classified military incident. But if that's true, why not retrieve the bodies and erase the evidence completely? Why leave a trail of confusing clues? Some believe the Soviet military preferred to classify rather than cover up, letting the story fade behind vague language. Others argue it was too remote, and retrieving 9 bodies in deep snow would have drawn even more attention. Then came reports from locals. Residents of nearby villages told investigators about bright spheres seen in the sky around the time of the incident. These weren't rumors. Multiple independent witnesses described glowing orbs hovering silently, moving horizontally, or disappearing suddenly. They weren't shooting stars or planes. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was testing R-7 rockets and parachute mines, both of which created similar fireballs in the sky. If parachute mines exploded mid-air, they could produce shock waves strong enough to cause the hikers internal injuries. The disoriented group, thinking an attack or explosion was happening, might have cut open the tent and fled. Some clothes testing positive for radiation could be explained by contamination from such weapons. But the theory doesn't explain why some hikers made it over a kilometer away before collapsing, or how certain body parts, like Ludmila's tongue, went missing. Others looked at forensic inconsistencies. For example, Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes might have resulted from natural decomposition in running water. Her body was found in a ravine which could cause soft tissue loss. That's plausible, but it still doesn't explain broken ribs and symmetrical fractures. Then there's the photo evidence. The last few frames on the hikers' cameras show the group joking, skiing, and setting up camp. One blurry image at night shows strange glowing spots, possibly snowflakes or lights. Another shows them smiling in heavy snow, no sign of distress. The images end abruptly. No photos capture panic or danger. A few researchers proposed psychological explanations. The theory of infrasound-induced panic suggests low-frequency vibrations caused by wind flowing over the mountain might have triggered irrational fear. Studies show infrasound can induce nausea, dread, and disorientation. In this scenario, the hikers, overwhelmed by panic, cut open the tent and fled. As they regained clarity in the forest, they tried to return, but exposure killed them. Yet this theory can't explain crushed bones or radioactive traces. Another idea involves paradoxical undressing due to hypothermia. Victims of severe cold sometimes feel an intense burning sensation and start removing clothing. But that only happens after prolonged exposure. The footprints showed calm walking, not confusion. They didn't scatter in random directions. It looked deliberate, as if they fled together with purpose. A less popular theory suggests the hikers were attacked by escaped prisoners or local hunters. But again, no footprints, no weapon marks, no signs of struggle. And why would attackers leave valuable gear and money untouched? One account often overlooked came from search team members. Some reported metallic debris and burn marks in the snow not far from the site. Others described burned treetops, as though scorched by heat from above. None of this appeared in the official files. If true, it supports the military experiment theory: explosions, flares, or aerial testing gone wrong. In the 2000s, new expeditions to Dyatlov Pass used modern equipment. No radiation was detected, but the terrain still matched 1959 records, too flat for a full avalanche. Computer models in 2021, however, proposed a delayed slab avalanche, a small block of snow dislodging under wind pressure. This could crush part of the tent, forcing the hikers to flee and cause injuries to those at the edge. But critics point out the injuries were too severe and the tent still intact. The Dyatlov Foundation, formed by relatives and researchers, continues to demand full transparency. They believe the Soviet government knew more. Some documents remain classified, even today. That fuels ongoing suspicion. What could be dangerous about 60-year-old case files? Even modern Russian authorities have offered conflicting explanations. In 2019, prosecutors reopened the case. In 2020, they concluded again that an avalanche caused the deaths. But avalanche experts and independent investigators disagreed, calling the conclusion politically convenient. So what actually happened? If you combine the strongest evidence: tent cut from inside, sudden danger; calm footprints, organized evacuation; barefoot or light clothing, rushed escape; internal trauma without external wounds; blast wave or heavy compression; radiation traces, military contamination; glowing orbs, airborne tests, all signs point toward an external force, not panic or natural disaster. Imagine the group is inside the tent at night. A loud explosion or bright flash occurs nearby. The pressure wave collapses part of the tent. They fear a second blast. In seconds, they slice open the fabric and move downslope. Some are injured. They try building a fire, climb a tree to look for danger, then attempt to return, but cold and exhaustion finish them. The last four, deeper in the ravine, succumb to injuries from the initial blast or later falls. Fits mostly, but without physical evidence of explosions or records of tests, it remains speculation. More than 60 years later, no single theory answers everything. Each explanation solves one piece but breaks another. And maybe that's why the Dyatlov Pass mystery endures. Not because it's unsolvable, but because too many truths were buried, altered, or erased. 9 hikers entered the Ural wilderness, intelligent, disciplined, united. Something extraordinary happened that night. Something so sudden and incomprehensible that even survival instincts failed. They left behind a tent, footprints in snow, and a riddle that time refuses to close. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains a story not of ghosts or monsters, but of fear, secrecy, and the unknown power of nature and man combined. No one can say for certain what happened on that mountain. All we have are traces, photographs, reports, bones, and one haunting conclusion. 9 hikers. One night. No survivors. No answers.